Boom! Kamusta, bro? How are you?
Okay naman, boy pa.
Doing well? How was your jiu-jitsu, bro?
Nagkasakit ng konti, so I haven't been training. Pero we promised to talk a little bit about the last fight, di ba? In our
Yeah.
last episode.
Oh, yeah. John Jones, man. Yeah, dude. How did you
So,
think about it?
so grabe, no? So I think so yung finish yan na talagang nakakagulat, no? With that guillotine from that really
One hand
strange
lang, bro. I don't know how they did
guillotine
it.
from a really strange position. So it's very interesting that the jiu-jitsu class I did after that. Hulaan mo kung anong lesson namin.
What, like Chichoka with one hand?
Guillotine from single arm guillotine from
Yeah,
standing.
like igaganon mo
Oh,
sa... Kasi ang hirap, di ba? Ang hirap.
oh,
But probably it's also because John Jones has just like a beast athleticism, right? I mean,
yeah, beast
the way he
athleticism.
beat the neck pag magka-crack na yung skull nun eh. Oo, grabe.
Sabi nga niya, 'di ba, sabi nga niya sa interview, 'di ba? Basta just let me hold the guy. Basta
Yeah.
mahawakan tapos na. You know, and he was corrected. Grabe talaga. This I mean, ultimately it's because he's just a great wrestler.
He's a
I think
monster,
yung
bro.
malabas dito, parang grabe talaga yung ascendance of
Yeah, bro.
wrestlers in MMA. And I remember we had this conversation before about wrestling versus jiu-jitsu in MMA. And I mean they're related disciplines, but you just have to say that this is the era of wrestlers.
Yeah, that's what
in
they usually
sport.
say, no? The wrestlers win. Except there was another match happened last week. Leon Edwards versus
You know,
Usman. And guess what?
oh,
Jiu-Jitsu won. Jiu-Jitsu won
oh
that.
yeah. Hindi naman
Leon
complete
Edwards
yung
is
mawawala.
I'm telling you, man. Yeah, I'm telling. If you combine jiu-jitsu with good striking, actually you can beat good wrestling. Because Usman is also top level wrestler, right?
Yung lamang naman ng wrestlers is yung training nila is not as
Hard.
gentle as jiu-jitsu.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
The jiu-jitsu gyms are very tranquil, well, sometimes very tranquil places. It is the gentle sport. So I think if you do jiu-jitsu with like a kind of wrestler's conditioning and striking, that looks cool.
But I mean, the good thing about I don't know, jiu-jitsu probably compared to wrestling is that the kind of like the pre-match, the training injury rates are a bit lower, if I'm mistaken. The wrestlers, ang taas ng injury rate nila eh.
Siguro mas maganda para sa mga thunders kagaya ko.
Kagaya natin, di ba? Like, because I have no wrestling background, etc. So my dad's roots is from Caspian region, so that's where the best wrestlers on earth come from, no? So this is Azerbaijan, northern Iran, southern Russia, Chechnya, and I'm embarrassing. I have no wrestling background, right? So I have like relatives, friends. They're all like, we go wrestling, don't touch me, bro. Like,
oh my God.
kukunin yung paa mo, tatakas kang gano'n, kukunin yung paa mo, gaganon mo, di ba? That's my insecurities. But I said, I don't think I want to do wrestling. I want to do this jiu-jitsu na lang. Sabi ko, mas parang pasok sa akin because it's very technical mind game, right?
Cerebral.
Very cerebral,
Oh.
exactly.
Oh, bueno. We can talk about this for hours, but I think
No. Don't. Wait for me. I'm gonna do the transition.
we have a topic for today. Okay, transition.
I'm very connected sana to I wanted to say
sige. Paano mo to areglohin? Sige.
Areglohin ko. Well, speaking of martial arts, of course, the Chinese are great in martial arts and all, di ba? And then I'm gonna connect it to Bruce Lee because Bruce Lee invented really mixed martial arts by, you can argue that he's the guy that invented martial arts. But the other thing that the Chinese have invented is TikTok, right? So that's what I want. Ikaw talaga, you don't have trust and confidence.
Masyado kang swabe, Brad. Masyado kang swabe.
Just give me a little bit time. Iko-connect ko lahat yan. So, here we are. Fast forward through Bruce Lee. Andito na tayo. Whoosh. Nasa TikTok na tayo. Kamusta, bro? I mean, nagti-TikTok ka ba?
Ako hindi ako nagti-TikTok pang Gen Z yan eh. I'm a hopeless millennial, di ba? There are many things about Gen Z I don't understand, from kind of like some of their language politics to some of the fashion. I can't go back in time and dress like I did in the 90s. Like I can't. Yeah. And the other thing I don't get about Gen Z is like is dancing on TikTok. So I am getting older. And I'm noticing like generational disparities.
Yeah.
Thank God. TikTok is something I don't get it, and I don't want to get into it because it's a bit of a time sake, but I understand the politics around TikTok. And
right.
I think that's a good place to begin, bro, TikTok as a kind of analog, or as a kind of jumping off point to talk about what people have called the new Cold War. So why are we thinking about TikTok today in light of that?
Yeah, well, actually, last night I also watched a documentary of Navalny. I really suggest people to watch that. I mean, if you want to get some cojones in life and have political conviction, watch documentary of Navalny. And Navalny is so good in TikTok. And there's scenes there. I don't want to do spoiler. He teaches his daughter, who's in Stanford right now, I think she's just 19, how to do TikTok videos and editing.
Oh,
So I'm
cool.
just saying, Gen X na siya. So I'm just telling you, bro, it's not too late for older millennials like us, right? Or borderline people, right? Going back to this now, I mean, first of all, I think I want to come back to the hearing well over the past few days. No? Nag-grill talaga yung TikTok CEO, very young guy. I mean, he founded TikTok just 2012 or something like that.
Yeah.
He's the typical young Chinese ambitious guy who wants to be.
He's Singaporean, man. I think he's
I'm sorry.
Singaporean.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Asian. I want to say Asian guy who wanted to make sure that he can be like the Steve Jobs of Asia. My apologies for the Steve Jobs of Asia, etc. Zuckerberg. I want to say, well, I mean, but I said no. I'll get into trouble if I will. There's something I want to say. I said never mind. But you can guess. But anyway, our Singaporean friend here. So he has been very successful about that. But I don't know, but if for people's knowledge, I don't know if you know that actually TikTok became TikTok because it bought out an American app few years ago. I was like musical or something. It's a musical app that actually you could like dance with it, video, etc. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It actually is based on some American platform, and then next level siya. Like classic case of adaptation, evolution, in the next level. I don't know if you watch the hearings. It was really quite hostile. I really felt for the guy, for a Singaporean friend. But at the same time, I don't buy his argument that this was just racism, etc. I think that's just an easy cop out to say, because I mean, he was really asked some legitimate question. Like, for instance, is TikTok censoring discussions of Xinjiang? Is TikTok giving the government any access, or is there any point that the government of China can have access to the data of tens of millions of Americans on this? So I think this was really where it was interesting. But for me, I'm very sure back home, Leloy, the videos of the grilling of the TikTok top guy are going to go viral on Weibo, their own version of Twitter, etc. in China. And I'm sure a lot of Chinese are going to attach some sort of a nationalistic, tone to it and say, like, this is like the white man not accepting that China is now has its own global brand. Now, I want to ask you one question, though, bro. Are you surprised by how quick China has managed to build global brands like cars? They're already leading. I mean, I just saw a BYD na kapitbahay. It's a tank car BYD. It looks great. It looks better even than Lexus, right? Na SUVs.
Really?
I was very impressed. Like,
and then the batteries are the same as the batteries of Tesla, because Tesla batteries are made in China.
Or even better, right? Or even better potential at the rate they're going, no? At the rate they're like getting it.
We can talk about Elon Musk, about where he's going, but anyway, that's a different topic.
Yeah, I know. No, but seriously, like, are you surprised by how far the Chinese companies, car companies, electronics companies, Huawei, all of these people have come TikTok? I mean, it's just 10 years, right? Since
I mean, TikTok for me is the most surprising one, because it's the greatest manifestation of Chinese soft power. In terms of production naman, the Chinese are going to produce goods like cars. They're going to export a lot of things. But the weakness of the Chinese has always been they don't have the cultural institutions that the United States has. Wala silang Hollywood. And wala man silang yung C-pop or whatever, yung pop nila is not as famous as K-pop. Their movies nobody really watches mainland movies the way they'll watch, say, they used to watch
Hong Kong movies.
Hong Kong movies, right? Or even now Korean movies. So they've always recognized na mahina sila sa soft power, and maybe itong TikTok is really the first manifestation of a kind of Chinese soft power, because it has eclipsed brands like Facebook. At least here in the United States, it eclipsed Facebook. It eclipsed even Instagram. These social media companies now are considered very stodgy in the context of TikTok, which has captured a new youth market. And of course, itong market na to, ito yung pinakagusto ng mga tao, because this is the market that you can really advertise to,
Richest market on earth,
as opposed to yung mga other ones. And what's surprising to me, of course, is you said there's a nationalist reaction in China, and that if there is going to be a nationalist reaction in China, that's only because there has been a nationalist reaction in the United States, a kind of bipartisan fear of this symbol of Chinese soft power, diba? The Biden administration has been talking about an American company acquiring TikTok, diba? That actually didn't start with the Biden administration. That started with the Trump administration. So this is China is the big bipartisan issue in the United States, which really tells you something about the mindset of the US, diba? Paano naging bipartisan issue ito, Brad? Why are people thinking?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I had somehow a semi front row seat to this transition, right? So I remember, of course, my speaking stints, my writing for think tanks in the DC really started 2014-15, right? I really got into the West Philippine Sea issue 2014, 2013. My first book, Asia's New Battlefield, it already came out 2015. I remember during this time, I was considered a hawk, right? Going there to the Washington, D.C. and saying, hey, I think we're a little bit too soft on China. I think we have to pay more attention. I think we have to help Philippines more. I think you cannot do what you did in Scarborough Shoal and just, let us be, leave us in the air,
Ano sagot sa'yo?
No, and back then was, we cannot, strategic ambiguity is important. We have to dialogue. The whole Obama shtick, right? That, the proper way forward is, great power engagement. This was also the time that the late Brzezinski, the former national security advisor and professor at Columbia University, he had this big idea of G2, right? If you want to solve the world problem, the two big guys have to come together. There were the term that we used to use a lot in political science international relations, Lele, was condominium, right? Essentially a dyad, where the two big guys will kind of share the world, right? And back then, the Wall Street was also very big on China. Big tech companies were also very invested in China. Remember, this is where also Zuckerberg was learning Mandarin. Of course, in wife, Chinese background. Steve Cook, of Apple, was getting big into China. So back then, we look like the cuckoo ones, right? And remember, we filed an arbitration case against China, and there was a lot of skepticism when we talk about this arbitration case. But suddenly, by 2017-18 onwards, just Trump opened a floodgate. He just opened a floodgate, right?
If I may, meron akong, just because this is a similar timeline, meron din akong ganyang experience, pero hindi kasing big time na experience mo. I was in Japan during that time.
Right.
And of course, at that time, grabbing debates about the remilitarization of Japan under Abe. And I was among academics, of course, academics tend to have a left-wing bent, liberal bent.
Yeah, exactly.
They hated it, right? And I remember when my Japanese colleagues would say, do you want to join us protesting against Abe's remilitarization? I would say, I'm sorry, I'm Filipino. And by that, I meant, what I meant was, I understand it sucks for Japan that you're going to spend a lot of your money, which could have gone to social services, into the military. That sucks for you. But as a Filipino, useful sa akin na magre-rearm ang Japan against China, because I thought that China was trying to colonize us.
Right.
So I was also hawkish at that time, and in Japan, at least the circles I hung out in, it wasn't a very popular position. But
I mean, let's be honest. They will use the F word, right, for some of these Japanese leaders that we in the Philippines actually see as great allies. No, so I have found myself in a weird spot. I also remember 2015 is also when Aquino was giving the speech at the Japanese Diet and essentially endorsing proactive Japan. I mean. Best PR for our best regional plan. That's how important it was for him. So you were there at the perfect time. But
sabi mo sa akin, yun yung moment na napamahal si Abe talaga kay Noynoy, no? I think he told me this.
And And Noynoy visited 7 times Japan, like crazy. And Abe-san, he also mediated between Trump and Duterte. So before Trump came to the Philippines, in November 2017, he did his own Gulf diplomacy. And of course, that was a few months after he did his own durian diplomacy, right? Or breakfast in bedroom with and Bongo. Remember that?
Yes.
So bro, so this is really the transition period.
Okay, so let's talk about the transition. So how did it get from, you're a hawk to now you're kind of like mainstream in the United States?
So 2017, 2018, a number of very influential articles come up. And it's by no less than people like, we know these people, Eli Ratner, who's now one of the top guys at the Pentagon. And the other one is, I think, by Kurt Campbell, right? Who's supposed to be the architect of pivot to Asia of Obama. And I really suggest you check this article on Foreign Affairs magazine, because this is where the floodgates were open as far as the the DC blob is concerned, right? You know, the elite circle, strategic thinkers. And the idea was this: let's admit it, we got China wrong. That the engagement, like economics, will overcome politics. It's not happening. It's actually the other way around. China is using economics to reinforce its political system, and it's just a matter of time that they'll try to challenge us, if not already. No, and then of course this is also.
So let's unpack that assumption though. For our listeners, ang assumption beginning with Nixon, but actually I think it went into overdrive during the years of Bill Clinton, which is kung payamanin mo yung China, essentially a richer country will democratize, because yun yung theory at that time, diba? A bigger middle class is a class that wants democracy, and all you need to do is trade with them, create that middle class.
Modernization theory.
More democratic, and that really went into overdrive under Clinton. But that was the policy of the United States ever since they opened relations with China, because prior to that, ang diplomatic relations ng US was really with Taiwan, right? And then according to Carlos P. Romulo, because him and Marcos opened diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, sumunod ang US.
I mean, of course, that's a very Filipino.
That's an overly Philippine-centric perspective. But anyway, so there's an acknowledgement and nag-fail yun. And why were people saying that it failed, that you can't trade your way into a more democratic China?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's keep in mind there was an awkward period from detente that Henry Kissinger kind of oversaw under Nixon, because remember, there was a Tiananmen massacre, right? So actually under George Bush Sr., there was a weird situation there, with China. Actually, there were sanctions on China, etc. But really, you're right, absolutely right. With Bill Clinton, it was really back to this idea that China is just too big to be isolated, and you rather have them on our side. The same way we helped Japan and Germany to get on our side by opening up to them. And of course, the really important milestone was the entry of China to the World Trade Organization. This is by 2001. Bill Clinton heavily went for it. He was like really the PR guy for China to get into the WTO. And this is a classic liberal Wall Street argument. If China becomes richer, as you said, there's more engagement, there'll be more interdependence, and the more there's economic interdependence, the more it creates structural constraints on geopolitical assertiveness of China. If not,
meron ng time, di ba, yung McDonald's, na uso ng 90s, yung McDonald's station. Kung meron daw McDonald's, wala daw bansa na may McDonald's.
That's why Donald Trump suggested there'll be McDonald's in Pyongyang. Speaking of McDonald's, right? No, but going back to this, so that was the idea, right? And people like Henry Paulson, who was the Federal guy Treasury guy of Bush, for instance, he was also a Goldman Sachs guy, and he played a very important role in opening up China's market. He advised top Zhou Rongji, for instance, the premier of China throughout the 1990s, 2000. So there was a time, Lelo, believe it or not, Goldman Sachs guys were essentially running the finance ministry of China. So you cannot blame some of these Americans getting full of themselves and thinking like, hey, you see, Chinese are open to us. So maybe like Japan and Korea, especially like Japan, we can turn them in our favor. If Germans could become an ally after everything, why not the Chinese? And remember, China was an ally of the West under Kuomintang, right? Remember, that's why the question when they went communist was who lost China. Now, moving forward here, clearly the evidence was, first of all, there's no reciprocity. So you trade with China, right? The U.S. opens up itself. I mean, the U.S. allows American investments goes in, but it's not like the Chinese are, for instance, allowing a lot of other companies to get in, like big tech companies like Facebook or Twitter, etc.
Tapos pag pumasok sila, baka nakawan pa ng technology.
And then they also do not allow a lot of American or Western companies to enter into critical sectors of China, like for instance, like telecom, etc. More than that, Lelo, you of course know that China also essentially bullied a lot of these foreign companies to give up their technology. The idea is that I'll give you 5-year market access. After 5 years, give me all the technology you got. That's why they suddenly have all of these nice cars and Huawei 5G, etc. So they were feeling.
I was actually talking to a cancer researcher. He's based in the Bay Area, and he's funding a lot of cancer research. And there was this one time that meron daw silang negotiations with China about some new cancer technology, and the Chinese government had said, okay, we're gonna let you come in. And so, but before that, mag-pitch muna kayo sa amin. Tell us what the technology is all about. After the pitch daw, when they get an idea of what the technology was about, hindi na sila sinagot, and wala na nangyari doon sa plano. So that's very typical. I think that story is illustrative.
Right. And then, of course, remember, there was also this big expose by Bloomberg of China kind of putting like mini chips inside some of the technology to essentially spy, corporate espionage. And Obama called it out. And then this is where papasok ang Pilipinas. Of course, mahalaga tayo, di ba? Yung nangyari sa West Philippines, yung Chinese artificial island construction, the Philippine Arbitration Award case. So Lele, all of these things were coming together, no? China not being helpful on a lot of issues. At the same time, China being a headache on a lot of issues, China stepping up its threats to Taiwan, China stepping up its aggressiveness in the South China Sea, China not having a reciprocal economic relationship, very close to many investments, technology stealing, all of these things. And so the argument was like, what is your evidence to say that more economic engagement with China has made China more like us, or at least less hostile? If anything, it's moving the other direction. And of course, the big person I didn't mention, Lelo, is Xi Jinping.
Because the pool side.
2013 to 2017-18, this is where it completely consolidates power and gets rid of the collective leadership system. So China became even more authoritarian, not less authoritarian. So the complete Deng Xiaoping collective leadership system was gone. So when Eli Ratner and all come in, remember, Eli Ratner used to be the, I think, national security advisor of Biden as the vice president when Biden was vice president. Kurt Campbell was Obama's top guy, architect of the pivot to Asia. So when you have Democrats saying we got China wrong, we cannot, that engagement doesn't work, and then you have Donald Trump coming out and saying we have to impose tariffs and all, you de facto have a bipartisan positioning here. And the next thing you know, China doesn't help its case, Lelo, because we have the advent of what you call the wolf warrior diplomacy, right? Remember, there's this Rambo-style movie in China. They beat up the Americans. Ang pangalan nila wolf warrior. So the next thing you know, the Chinese diplomats are so aggressive. They say things right and left. So by 2019 onwards, we were primed already for a very, very tense relationship between China and United States. And Xi Jinping, if there are two things that are constant about Xi Jinping are this. First, he likes crisis because crisis allows him to create the sense of urgency for consolidation power. And Xi Jinping is a man of history, a big man of history. He wants to be a big man of history, right? So when you put all of these ingredients together, really, I don't think status quo was working anymore. So this bipartisan context makes sense. And lastly, I would say, Lelo, let's be honest, Americans cannot accept a real challenge to themselves. We saw what they did to Japan in the 1970s and 80s. Plaza Accord, we discussed that. Well, they're feeling that the Chinese are reaching the Americans in terms of GDP size, in terms of technology. So I think all of these things came together. So if there's one thing that can bring Americans together in a very polarized situation, is threat to their global hegemony or number one style.
We have to admit, both in the United States and in the Philippines, one of the reasons why matunog yung Chinese issue is because, frankly, there is racism. There are valid reasons to fear China. Of course, it's an authoritarian state. Yung ginagawa niya, yung concentration camps sa Xinjiang. But if you look at the tenor of, especially the Republican Party, and even here even in the Philippines, with people like Winnie Monsod, for example, there are real racist cases being made to contain China, and that part is scary. So I think it requires a delicate balance here. On the one hand, you need to be able to criticize the Chinese state for being authoritarian, but on the other hand, you need to be careful about criticizing Chinese people, and that of course became the problem sa atin nung uminit to, when you had really racist columns by people like Winnie Monsod, Manong Frankie Jose, who just conflated Chinese people with the Chinese state. And I think you get some of that here in the US. Kagaya ng Donald Trump, for example, when he blamed China for COVID and called it the China virus, acts of anti-Asian violence here. So we are in a delicate position, and medyo pasakali lang yun. The next question actually I wanted to ask you is, the other thing that confounds this, apart from Xi Jinping's personality, and he really wants to become the next Mao Zedong, right? That's why there's Xi Jinping thought. The other thing that confounds this is ideas from certain sectors that there is a kind of new axis that's emerging, that parang we're in a place similar to before World War II, where Mussolini and Hitler become allies, and now the new axis is supposedly Putin and Xi Jinping. What are your thoughts on this idea that there's a new axis?
Yeah, actually, this is something that it's one of the few things that quite surprised me. It's because for a long time I've been very skeptical of this, what they call bear dragon bear, whatever, right? Why? Because if you talk to Russians throughout the decade, they'll tell you one of their biggest fears is their huge border with China, and that area, Siberian region, is very energy rich, but very sparsely populated. And more and more Chinese businessmen coming in, marrying locals, taking over, essentially make, you know what I'm saying, right? So, in fact, one reason why Russia keeps a very large nuclear stockpile is because it knows there's no way that it can conventionally hold China back at some point. So the nuclear weapons are actually less about NATO, but more about potential. So this was the state of discussion. And then remember, there's also, this is where it gets interesting. On the far right, you have people like Steve Bannon saying, we have to create a grand Christian alliance, right? White alliance, right? Russia, Europe, we're all the same. And then in Germany, there's always this, the dream alliance, the Russo-German alliance, right? So there's that far right version. But interestingly, even Biden, when early on he came into power, his number one priority was to drive a wedge between Russia and China, because it knew, we know what's happening, right? So if you look at really the geopolitics of the past century, in the most simplistic term, it's defined by three major powers, right? Russia, China, US, or at least you can say that's the one of the full triangles, right? For a long time, China was the junior partner in this, right? Soviet was a massive power on its own. US was a massive power. China was a junior one. But the Russians are realizing not only are they a junior to the US, increasingly they're becoming junior to China. And junior in what sense, Leloy? They're being forced to sell their oil and gas dirt cheap, right? They're being forced, Leloy, to give up their high-tech military technology. I mean, the Russians don't have much of a high-tech left, right? Their only high-tech is like fifth-generation fighter jets, some missile systems. They have hypersonic missiles. They're essentially being forced to give up all of that by China, because so this is before Ukraine invasion, the full invasion. This is like, this is post-Crimea invasion, right? So Russia is not totally isolated yet during this time. It's still engaging with Europe, etc. So there was a legitimate hope, I think, by a lot of people to make sure Russia doesn't go fully into embrace of China. At the same time, there was also a hope that China, that Xi Jinping will be rational enough not to get too much in bed with Putin, because Putin is a little bit impulsive, as we saw in Crimea, invasion of Georgia. Yeah, and remember, Russia is a declining power structurally, shrinking population, economy really not dynamic. China, time is on its side, at least on the surface, right? So why would you want to side with a party that is kind of structurally in decline, right? When you're so it doesn't make sense, right? It makes sense for US to try, for China to try to make. So the Chinese strategy, this was the mirror, Leloy. They wanted to drive a wedge between Europe and US. Just in case US goes crazy, we'll have Europe on our side. And this is where I'm quite surprised at how weird things turned out. So, Lela, I'll tell you this. Last year in Munich Security Conference, I was there. So this is just a week before the invasion of Ukraine. So Zelensky was there, Kamala Harris was there, but the other person who was there was Wang Yi, the former foreign minister and now the state counselor. He was there, and he sounded in a very neutral way, like, we respect, we want to respect the integrity, sovereignty. You could clearly see Wang Yi wanted to impress the Europeans, to say, hey, we're not just like those crazy guys, we're sound and all about it. That's why I'm honestly quite surprised, but the part of me is still skeptical how much of this is really Xi Jinping and Putin being pals for life, because I know, of course, there's psychological reason. First of all, we know that Xi Jinping is obsessed about the decline of Soviet Union. He reads a lot of Russian literature. I think one thing we have in common, hopefully it's the only thing. Yeah, he likes. And then they're almost the same age. I think like few months like difference in la. So I was like, it's creepy, right? So, and then there's also, Putin also likes Xi Jinping very much. There's just some sort of a bromance there that is quite...
Yung macho bromance.
Because he didn't have that with Hu Jintao, or I don't know, Jiang Zemin or whatever, right? Age gap, personality. But with this guy, Xi Jinping, he has that kind. I think they met 41 times, right?
So may amor talaga. And then obviously, as yung pinaka-obvious na nakikita ng mga tao is you have two authoritarian leaders who have essentially built their countries around them, who have created a cordon sanitaire around them that prevent any form of criticism, that essentially isolate them not only from their countries, but from, the rest of the world. And then the big similarity that people see is that these are people who are vehemently against the US-led post-war order and who want to turn that around, right? So, Putin, he hates NATO. And then of course, for Xi Jinping, he doesn't like the kind of projection of American power in the Pacific. So on that level, diba, there's that kind of affinity. should we read a lot into that? Is there more to it than the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Yeah, so my understanding here is Xi Jinping is not giving up on at least his pretension to still trying to help Ukraine and Russia to come together. So he still had the Zoom call or a phone call, whatever, with Zelensky. Obviously, the Ukrainians are not happy because suddenly
Pumunta siya sa Russia eh.
Yeah. No, and evidence is coming out, Leloy, that the Chinese are actually providing drones and some weaponries. Guess what? Via Turkey, which is a NATO member. So isa pang isa pang pasaway yan yung Turkey na yan under Kuya Tatay Erdogan, di ba? Maybe next month let's talk about Turkey because they're gonna have an elections and that's a big one, Leloy. There's a lot to discuss there, interestingly, because Erdogan is another big is kind of like the Putin of the Middle East, right? But going down here, no, the thing kasi is, I don't know, a part of me feels Xi Jinping is kind of torn, right? Because the rational Xi Jinping says this: I'm just going to come here and juice out Putin and just help Putin just enough not to be fully decimated. Because, of course, the war in Ukraine also drains NATO, right? The longer the war in Ukraine goes, the harder for Europe to help US here in the Pacific, right? Second, the longer the war goes, the more Russia is going to be desperate, the more they'll rely on China, the more China can juice it out. Cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap military technology, right? But at the same time, I think there's a part of Xi Jinping which is thinking like, but I mean, why not parang ala digong? It's you and me against the world. I think there is a part of him that is thinking about like, alam mo yung parang
ride or die, baby.
Yeah, I mean, like there's a point when nag-flirt kayo with someone and then like, you kind of feel it, but you know, like I'm not sure it's gonna work, and then like one day like, damn it, let's go. You know, let's go. I think there's may pagkaganon, and minsan nag-Freudian slip or may slip of tongue ito si Xi Jinping. So nung mag-goodbye na siya kay Putin, remember the opening when they were coming together, you could see Putin was really like that and she's like that. But towards the end, suddenly Xi Jinping, said something like, I know you two of us together, we're gonna change the history for the next 100 years. What's going on here, right?
Naging baduy bigla.
Putin goes like that, like I mean, like, man, it's like it's a weird bromance. I'm telling you, bro. I mean, it's a stuff of novel, right? So I think a part of Xi Jinping, because he's a lonely guy, right? No one is his level. Putin is the only guy, even if diminished na siya yung kutzpa ni Putin, I think he kind of likes that, right?
Tsaka sa loob, wala namang I mean, the thing is, if you're on top, and if you're on top of a local bureaucracy, it's lonely on top kasi wala ka ng kaibigan yan eh. Kasi you try to befriend that, yung mga people who want to befriend, yung matatakot sila sa'yo, so they become supplicants, sycophants, right? So it's very lonely there. You get it. I'm sure you got it.
You want to peer, right? You want to peer because if there's one man, Leloy, who has been the strong man the longest in our lifetime, is Putin, right? 20 years. We're uncontested. Think of anyone else who has had that long in charge of a major power. No one.
Yeah.
No one. So obviously democracy na yung mga
Well, there's Hun Sen, the longest serving prime minister. But,
I said major
power.
I'm sorry. Of course, you can find me a lot of puny dictators. Like, no offense to them, right? Or you can find middle power authoritarian leaders like Saudi Arabia, ganun. But I'm talking about major powers. Xi Jinping cannot relate to middle or low. Exactly. So yeah.
So yung tanong ko, okay.
Sorry. But this is where I'm gonna ask you, okay? I'm gonna come back at you, bro. Ganito, do you think it's even appropriate to use the word new Cold War? I mean, in what sense is it similar to the Cold War as you understand it as a historian? And in what ways is it not similar? And then I'm gonna throw my own crazy idea here.
Alam mo, ibabalik ko to sa'yo, unfortunately, because yung reading ko nito actually comes from you. Yung historical reading ko nito comes from you, which is that the Cold War never really ended.
Right.
The Cold War never really ended. Meron ka ng sleeper Cold War because the USSR is nothing compared to contemporary China. So in a way, sabi mo parang
alam mo pala yung argument
sa computer game, parang natalo mo yung boss, pero actually as you were beating the boss, the real boss was a kind of sleeper. So, or if you want to turn this into an Avengers kind of thing, you thought Thanos was the boss. But actually, there's still Kang the Conqueror down the line, right? The real challenge is a sleeper challenge down the line. And one of the reasons why we didn't think it was an extension of the Cold War was because the United States deceived itself into thinking that there was this new mode of neoliberal engagement through trade that would change the situation. So in a way, the reason why we think of it as a new Cold War is because there was this moment, this end of history moment where the liberal powers thought na panalo na, when in fact nandyan siya because as you said, may Tiananmen Square naman eh. Never naman naging hindi authoritarian yung China, di ba? It went into overdrive under Xi Jinping. But I mean, it's a single party. It's always been a single party state, right? It is an authoritarian state, and it's a scary place to be. So yun yung sagot ko sa'yo. Ang balik ko sa'yo nito is, because this is Nexus. Asan ang Pilipinas dito? Kasi parang ang gulo-gulo ng Pilipinas, di ba? Parang
I know.
From Noy to Digong to Marcos, and of course, ang lumalabas ngayon is maybe Digong is the outlier. Maybe actually there is a continuity in Philippine foreign policy, and Digong was just like that brief moment where the foreign policy went berserk a little bit, and now we're kind of like back to normal.
Right. Now, yeah, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you. I mean, or I agree with you citing me, right? But Adam Tooze kind of also influenced me slightly on this. But my idea was this is the real Cold War because, first of all, I think the idea of new Cold War, Cold War never made sense because it was never cold. There was a lot of back and forth, proxy wars, and so the old Cold War was questionable on that. And second is what you also said, which is Soviet Union was really not a match. I mean, its economy was puny compared to the combined alliance and all of that. So it was always overrated, right? It was an overrated boogeyman. So in short, yeah, to be Shakespearean, it was the opening act. It was
I mean, let me just tell you this. Remember in the 1950s when Khrushchev went to the United States, he was amazed at the technology of the United States, yung washing machines, all these consumer products today. So it was a technologically backward society in that sense. So how can you win a Cold War if your technology is so backward? Ngayon, if a Chinese leader goes to the United States, sees the technology of the United States, they'll say, I see that. We have that, right? That's so different from the way Khrushchev would interact with American presidents.
I mean, there's nothing in the US that will impress Xi Jinping. Like, had Xi Jinping visit US, like, there's nothing impressed. Like, he'll actually be impressed how backward the Americans are. This is your Facebook. I mean, look at my TikTok. I don't know if you've tried it. It's crazy. The algorithm.
Your trains, and your trains are slow. I mean, that's what the Chinese
slow. Your cars are old model. All their cars are EV, 10 times better than Tesla and cheaper. Like, so you're absolutely right. That's a very good way of putting it. Like, if Xi Jinping were to visit the US today, he'll be actually embarrassed for this. Like, this is the best you got to show us. So even in military, like China has 2 5th-generation fighter operating, and they're like 2-seaters, right? I mean, if you want to go Top Gun about it. So you may question the quality, but they're going to get there. It's just a matter of time, no? Now, going back to this Philippines, saan ang Pilipinas here, lo? So my sense is just when we were like finding our footing in the post-Cold War era, the real one happened. And this is even more in your face. So, I don't know if you
want to si tatay.
It's like, okay, tapos ng Cold War, ano nang gagawin natin dito? Biglang, oh, di ba? Parang ganun nangyari, bro. So, I think, and then, after that, Junior, di ba? Like Magellan Junior. Like, I mean, can you imagine how stressful the job of these people is? Kaya sabi ko, bro, first of all, going back to Tatay, one reason why I think he was like all over the place is, imagine this, bro. You're a long-time mayor in a non-capital city, to put it nicely. Like, I don't want to offend her, but I don't mean it in a bad way. I'm from Baguio, okay? Provinciano din ako. But what I'm saying here is, you go from that, and then you're president of country in the middle of an emerging new Cold War. And then suddenly you're on Forbes magazine. China, Xi Jinping is calling you. Donald Trump is calling you. Lelo, you put yourself in the space, in the I'm not excusing his craziness, but I'm saying, di ba? Grabe, di ba? And then now, ngayon naman si Magellan Jr., he suddenly found himself from posh diplomacy and Grand Prix diplomacy to like, this is serious. Like, oh my goodness, a war could happen in Taiwan, right? I think like, I don't want to say I feel for these guys, but like, I think these guys really had some sleepless nights here and there. So I think nung nagreklamo si tatay, anong gagawin ko, yung mga ganun, I think some of that is true. I think he had some sleepless nights. I think the same thing for Marcos Jr. Now, speaking of the Philippines, of course, Leloy, we cannot do it the way we did it during Marcos Sr. because now the China is the big boy, not Russia or Soviet Union anymore. Number two, we cannot also do it like Aquino days, because US is not as dominant as it used to be just even 10, 15 years ago, right? And definitely the Tatay Digong way also didn't work, because we forward deployed all concessions and got nothing out of China. But this is where, Lela, I think China is also showing weakness. In what sense? You see, if you mentioned some guy, Hun Sen, right? Very interesting. Because my sense, Leloy, was the Chinese thought, and when I say Chinese, not Xi Jinping, but his envoy here, the guys who are studying the Philippines in their departments here. I think they thought Duterte is like a Hun Sen, like, oh, we got Duterte, the rest of the country will follow. They didn't appreciate this is Mexico of Asia, right? There are 10 veto players. There's the AFP, there are the senior diplomats, assistant secretary, who don't want to sign any joint exploration agreement. There's the Philippine media, which sometimes goes, you're right, a little bit even, prejudicial to China. So many factors that what made it very difficult for Philippines to turn out like a bigger Cambodia. And I think that's where we saw the limits of China, because China, the Philippines is either just an American puppet or a bigger Hun Sen. And now they're realizing Philippines is actually a complicated country, a messy country, and their politicos are unreliable. One day they tell you something, the other day they tell you another thing. Case in point, Marcos Jr. He says one thing in Beijing, another thing in Davos within the span of 2 weeks. I think the Chinese are now having their moment of like, what are we going to do about the Philippines? But let me make this argument. This is probably controversial because I don't want to give credit to either Duterte or Marcos Jr. on this necessarily. But my sense, Leloy, I hope I'm not being overly romanticizing. I think the Philippines is actually in a strategic sweet spot.
Yes.
And I'll explain you why. Ganito. So we have now the EDCA, right? But how we will implement the EDCA, pwede natin i-dribble yan, pwede natin i-tweak yan. Like, anong exercise?
Pwede natin hindi pansinin under Digong.
Exactly. So, pwede natin balikan. So, my point is, the EDCA suddenly gave us a leverage with China. So, when we talk to China, we can tell to them, ganito pare, ganito, kung wala kang investment dyan in the next 2 years, etong bibigay namin sa mga Amerikano. Yung Mavulis, yung Fuga, yung Cagayan, Isabela, ganun. Pero kung nag-invest ka, baka naman pare, pwede namin medyo, we can do that actually.
Paimikin ng konti yung mga kano.
Bro, we can do that. And I'll tell you this, bro. The Americans are not like 50 years ago, as some leftist comrades would say, right? Like they control the Philippines. It's not like that anymore, bro. The US, they cannot impose themselves on us. Tapos na yan. I was just talking to Robin Carranza, no? We had a podcast the other day. I suggest people check it. Robin Carranza was telling me, I didn't know that Bush was bullying us not to join ICC. We still joined the ICC. I think this is right? So actually, behind the scenes, there are many times we said no to the Americans. It's not true that Americans, we're like the puppet of America. It's not true. And Tatay Digong showed that actually can defy them and even more and get away with it. So we can say no now to America, and we can say yes when it serves our purpose. So in short, if magaling talaga si Marcos Jr., he can make the most out of this strategic sweet spot. Kung hindi siya magaling, sasayangin na lang natin ito and we'll be in big trouble in 2 to 3 years. Let's go crazy in Taiwan.
I wanna slightly dwell on what you were saying. That one of the reasons why Filipinos don't understand the China conflict is we have a generation of, let's admit it, baby boomers who were raised in the old Cold War and raised in the immediate post-war period, wherein the American State Department really had a stake in the Philippines and would really deploy CIA agents in the Philippines. Panahon ni Magsaysay, where you had Edward Lansdale battling the hoax, right? And, ang politics sa kanila is every time there's a white person and you're not sure about what the politics of the white person are, tatawagin mong CIA, di ba? Ganyan yung style, di ba? Parang this idea that the United States is lurking in every corner. And then, of course, when you read it from that perspective, kung anti-US yung perspective mo, you say, maybe China's better because actually, they're run by a communist party, right? Because we have a lot of boomers who like the idea of Mao Zedong and who like the idea of a communist, or at the very least, a non-capitalist alternative to the United States. So they bring those Cold War politics and they read present politics using that perspective. And you get really absurd diagnoses of the situation. And one can hope, Richard, that when we're old, that when we're in our 70s and that we're in our 80s, we are not using the experiences of today to read the Philippines of that period, because we just really need to grow with the times, and geopolitics shifts. And if you don't acknowledge those shifts in geopolitics, and of course the growth of the Philippine state as an independent sovereign entity, just gonna mess up the reading of things, and it's it's very frustrating seeing these people comment now. I'm tempted to say I don't want to be ungenerous, pero parang mag-retire na kayo, please. Tama na.
Or maybe do more podcasts. You know, I mean, like one reason why. I mean, I could have easily be part of the blob, right? You know, I'm on these think tank circles, but the reason why I'm not absorbed by it, I always can think, at least I feel independent, is because I'm very active on social media, engage with people from very different backgrounds, right? So that helps me to keep updated. And there are assumptions that I always revisit. So technology and interaction forces me to constantly update.
So I like that term though, the blob, and that is actually my next question to you. In the United States, diba, and if you read Obama's memoirs, he says that there's only so much a US president can do with respect to foreign policy because there is a blob. And by blob, he means yung mga think tanks, yung mga people who are in the current State Department, mga ex-State Department people, academics, who kind of create an ideational and institutional space where that constrains foreign policy making, and it creates certain givens in US foreign policy, like for example support for Saudi Arabia, which was a very difficult challenge during his time. I want to ask you about the Philippines, because you said that China was surprised we were not Hun Sen, and that Duterte could not just alter the course of Philippine foreign policy. This is a similar lob of inertia that creates a kind of foreign policy inertia, or does that exist in the Philippines? Does that obtain in the Philippines?
It's a very different context in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, you essentially have interest group based think tanks, right? Which have more or less fixed points of view, and I don't think their points of view actually evolves that much over time. That's the sense I have. So a lot of supposed think tanks here are at least attached either to some business group or to some former top politician.
Ex-diplomat.
Yeah, exactly. Yung mga ganun, diba? And some of them have good stuff to offer. I think, but the point is,
hindi namin sinisiraan ng ADR dito, actually, believe me.
Actually, I want to say ADR actually does a pretty
good
job,
ADR,
right? And in fairness, people like Dindo Manhid, I've been interacting with him since my LaSalle days, right? In fairness, I can see his views are constantly updated. He's in tune with things. But if you look at the others, I don't want to name names. It's like there's like collection of ex-diplomats with their, internal echo chambers, etc. And then they're like this fake think tanks by some businessman who clearly has an interest in another country and pushing their agenda. So I don't think, first of all, the think tank culture is as mature. And then the thing I say with think that with the blob, remember, blob is like a politically correct version of deep state or something like that, right? So,
that's right.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, the Philippines, even the state itself is incomplete to even have it. I'm like, so I don't see as much parallel there. And let's be honest, in the Philippines, intellectuals don't have as much influence.
But let me just say that there are institutions in the Philippines that prevent complete 180s. Like pinakamalaking example dito is Delphine Lorenzana, right? Insofar as there's a foreign policy defense blob in the Philippines, and Delphine Lorenzana is kind of your perfect representation of a kind of post-war Philippine defense leader, right? He's very close to the United States. He went to the United States, and then he became a general and became Secretary of Defense, and kind of maintained the special relationship between the US and the Philippines, despite the fact that his principal was kind of going crazy. And in fact, very interesting, because his experience as Secretary of Defense mirrored the experience of yung Secretary of Defense ni Trump, diba? Si Secretary Mattis, who was actually more of a conventional blob type Secretary of Defense, who was also beholden to a kind of nutty off-kilter president.
But not a yes man.
Not a yes man. Yeah.
He resigned, So in fairness to Lorenzana, my sense with him,
he lasted.
He lasted, and I know that he held his own ground here and there. And in fairness to him, he spilled the beans once in a while. So actually, Lorenzana is a fascinating case. I called him the Mattis of the Philippines, and a lot of foreign friends were kind of like trying to they use it. But I mean, my point is,
he's better. He's better because he was able to right the ship, and he was able to stay there.
But the thing that
institutional stability of the Department of Defense.
Lorenzana is a special case because he used to be a veteran defense attaché for like 10 years in DC. So he's very used to the think tank culture. So he's very confident to engage in policy debate, wonky debates. That's why he was we were very comfortable together, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure our other defense ministers have been like that. No, if you look at the more traditional generals, like they're more operational, tactical guy. They don't want to talk about big strategy, etc. Especially in the case of the Philippines. Now, there's this chance that Gibo becomes the next defense minister. At least this is the information I'm getting. So
Interesting.
let's see. Maybe Gibo will have a different approach, because I think Gibo, aside from Lorenzana, was among our more interesting, dynamic defense minister, I would say. Mercado also another interesting guy. So I think these three are the defense ministers who impress me. These are the defense ministers who were not overshadowed by the foreign ministers, because usually the foreign secretaries in the Philippines are the senior secretary, and the defense guy is more like the operation logistics guy. But when Lorenzana was there, Gibo was there, and Mercado was there, they were they held their own. So I look forward to seeing, because with Carlito Galvez, he's a very great operational tactical guy, very polite guy, great guy. But I still want to see more how open he is with strategic discussion and all. But again, just ending on the Philippines on this discussion of new Cold War. I mean, the thing kasi here, Lelo, is as the Philippines becomes more developed, right? Because umaangat naman tayo some interesting questions are emerging and difficult questions are emerging, because at some point we have to decide. Kasi diba, the big thing, Lelo, right now is the great technological Iron Curtain that is coming out, no? Whereby US doesn't want to use Chinese semiconductors. China is developing its own semiconductors. So I think we're now speaking economics, right? So if the Philippines wants to move up the value chain, create more and more sophisticated products, etc., at some point we'll have to choose na, Lelo. And this is the problem I have, because swerte yung mga kapitbahay natin, because they globalized earlier than us in terms of their supply chains, Malaysia, Thailand, etc. They had a time where they can have the cake and eat it too. Be nice to China, be nice to... Pero things are going to get very tricky for us, Leloy. And one argument I'm hearing is perhaps BBM feels confident enough that he'll get enough out of the West that even if we have estrangement with China, anyway, China is going to be plugged out of the Western system. We can be with the Western system. That's one argument I'm hearing, and I'm surprised.
Well, kasi service economy din naman tayo, and because we're geared as a service economy, we are really going to rely more on the United States if we're going to if the BPO strategy is still going to obtain.
No, but Lele, the BPO and all will be my AI lahat.
That's true.
So I'm talking about, like, for instance, the Philippines has $30 billion of exports of semiconductors, but like the lower levels, right? So we want to move up that. Like, I know that Philippines is known for just services or whatever, but actually we have a decent manufacturing base, export-oriented manufacturing base, and we want to elevate that. So the big question right now is, do you want to join the CPTPP, no? Yung TPP ni US dati na Japan-led na yan. Do you want to join the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? Because once we join those things, it will be a very kind of Americanized way of doing trade and approaching industrialization and all. So my fear, Leloy, is the day will come soon that the Philippines not only will have to make some big choices, but our space for industrial policy will be even further.
Brad, ang makikita ko dyan, wala tayong choice. Inevitably, we are going to have to join these trading blocs, because no matter how strong kind of nationalist discourse is in the Philippines around free trade, and you see it even in President Marcos, we talked about it, diba? He was very hesitant to join the RCEP, and so was his sister, because there is this kind of, if you like, neo-mercantilist tradition in the Marcos family. Pero wala, napipilitan because otherwise may iwanan And I understand that, you said, sleepless nights, that probably causes sleepless nights in the Marcos camp. And so inevitably these kind of forces that are larger with us, I think, are just going to bring us naturally into that fold, and we're just going to have to deal with it. I think
that's the tech part.
This is one example. I think, unfortunately, this is one case of Tina. There is no alternative. I don't know if I'm being clear.
So Thatcher of you. No, but this is the other thing I want to say, Lelo, is I kind of, and now I'm going to be bashed again for this. So the new term I'm kind of introducing is Jaffos, right? So everyone talks about AUKUS, Australia, US.
I like that. Nabanggit mo na to.
So now Jaffos, and it's kind of getting into the conversation right now. So
I like it.
I used it the other day, sila Henry Kissinger and kausap ko. The other day I use it in the media, etc. I think people like it. Friends from India, from
I like it.
They kind of pick it up. This idea of Japan, Philippines, US trilateral alliance. This is looking more and more probable. So
How about Australia? How about Australia? Shouldn't you find a way to increase
Australia is already
Australia?
super invested na sa AUKUS. They're going to spend $228 billion. And let's be honest, Australians are kind of snob to the Philippines, my sense is strategically, and we're kind of also snob to them. Like, what are they? Deputy sheriff lang ng US. Doon na tayo sa Amerikano. And Japan, bro. Japan. Diba? I mean, my goodness, Japan is so big in the Philippines. 80% of our ODA for infra investment, according to Joke Nice, from Japan alone, right? The first underground metro we'll have in Manila so will be from Japan. So Japan is so big to the Philippines, even bigger
this
than
this is a kind of reunion of MacArthur's children.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the historian in you is going to be giddy about it. So I think this Jaffos one is what I'm going to pay. So speaking of new Cold War, the Philippines is getting more and more. And the reason why I'm slightly optimistic about the Jaffos, of course, Japan has its own domestic problems, pacifist constitution, but it's because pansin mo, Leloy, lahat ng mga presidente natin had good relations with Japan, which is exactly what we discussed with the podcast. So I think even if Sara Duterte or Tulfo or whoever next president, of course, Lenny too is the next president, mabash na ako. I think they're great. I mean, si Lenny nga, shogun na ngayon, di ba? Shogun na siya, di ba? With Mount Fuji and all that. So, my sense is if we play certain cards, I think this Jaffos could be one big thing. And why? Especially because of Taiwan. We're just 100 nautical miles away from Taiwan. Our naval base in Mavulis, the Diaoyu, Okinawa Islands are also very close to Taiwan. So, even if there's no war,
we should actually not forget our cultural ties with Taiwan. I mean, these are really deep, right? For example, if you are Ivatan, you have natural ties with Taiwan. There are indigenous people in Taiwan who kind of practically share the native culture of the Ivatan. If you're Chinese Filipino, there's a history, of course, of the education of Chinese Filipinos being anchored on the Taiwanese model. And then, of course, Taiwanese are essentially Southern Chinese, a lot of them Hokkien speaking, very similar to our Chinese Filipinos. So there's a real affinity there, and we can't extricate ourselves from that, diba? This is the kind of world we belong in.
And there are 200,000 Filipinos at least in Taiwan. And Taiwan is responsible for 37% of entire computing power in the world. I mean, Taiwan is the giant, it's like a dwarf giant dynamo, right? In terms of contribution to global economy, right? So and like a part of me, because I deal a lot with our Taiwanese friends. I used to be a visiting scholar. So like it's so weird. We barely talk about Taiwan in the Philippines, right? Considering they're just so close to us and they're so important to the world. And God forbid the war happens, there's no escape from that. Geography and alliance with the US. Titirahin talaga tayo ng China nan in an event of war. Talaga unless we end the alliance with US now. Yeah.
There's a kind of element here of, I think, in many ways, destiny, geography, and previous geopolitics creating a destiny for us, regardless of who our president is. Like, one of the things we advocate in this podcast is to look outside the domestic politics and look how the world is determining what's happening here. So I know sa balik-taktakan natin, it's so nice to say na ito yung gagawin ni Lenny, ito yung gagawin ni Marcos, magkaiba yun because one is a good guy, one is a bad guy. And what we're saying here is actually, if you look at foreign policy, there are certain things that are happening that will allow us to have some form of a coherent foreign policy regardless of who is in power, just because of the way the world is structured right now, just because of who our natural allies are, who our historical allies are, who the people who will treat us well. Because I honestly think that regardless of who the president is, Japan will treat us better than China and has historically treated us better than China. And our politicians, from Lenny Robredo to Rafi Tulfo, as you say, to Ferdinand Magellan Jr., they know this. And in that sense, you can think about, I know we're not realists here, but you can think of a Filipino foreign policy interest here that we can kind of have a sane discussion over. That's also why I like discussing foreign policy, because we can become Filipinos in our discussion of foreign policy and not internal na magkakaaway.
And you know this even better than me because you were based in Kyoto. There are many Japanese scholars who know the Philippines intimately. So there will not be lack of nuanced understanding of the Philippines in ways that I think, unfortunately, China had. I think China has very few real scholars who understand the Philippines on its own terms. But Japan...
I've spoken to many Chinese scholars of the Philippines who love the Philippines, and their frustration is Philippines studies in Japan, in China, is not really Philippine studies. It is
American
security studies.
Yeah,
It is security studies. In other words, they're trying to figure out yung defense relationship nila with the Philippines, and they're trying to figure out yung geopolitical relationship nila with the Philippines. There are very few scholars, like, you know, Chinese scholars, like, for example, Professor Bao Mahong, who really love the Philippines and who take the time to learn our language, understand our culture, and look at us not just as a kind of geostrategic entity, as part of a broader plan from China, but who look at us as a people, right? And that is, of course, in contrast to the way Japanese scholars view us. Japanese scholars, like, you know, banggit na natin, you know, Wataru Kusaka, Hiromu Shimizu. These are people who see us for who we are. And it's not to say that there are no Chinese scholars who do that. Professor Bao Mahong, one of the great Chinese scholars of Philippine studies, but they are few and far between as compared.
And of course, Lele, I also meant like in terms of policy influence, right? Because my sense is they're Japanese Philippine scholars who have policy influence. You know, I have students who are from Japanese foreign ministry, right? Who I'm sure will be very influential in shaping their country's foreign policy towards us in the coming years and decades. No, so yun lang sinasabi ko. Anyway, I know that you have to go, so maybe we can end this episode here because we want to talk about very shortly a little bit about the Philippines, a little about the bardagulan in the Philippines, and maybe a little bit of honest discussion, maybe only 15 minutes or so. So thank you, Alele, for that. Let's just end this episode on this note.